Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner.
Chapter 5. Drake Tales. Fletch spent the morning building a litter with the help of Yonder. They gathered 2 small saplings from the edge of a small creek that ran its way twisting merrily at the foot of the hill they had benighted upon. Yonder's massive jaws made quick work of ripping the trees from the earth. Fletch gathered rushes and stripped the bark from green trees to use for binding. While they worked, Fate slept. She was most talented in light craft technique, but everyone has their limits. Yesterday she had pushed herself beyond anything Fletch could ever have accomplished, and loath was he to press her with an early start. The prince also still slept. Outside the fitful spurts and twitches accompanied of troubled dreams, he may as well have been made of stone. Fate had told Fletch all of what she'd seen during the scry. If the crimson catalyst and his unique fur coloring was not enough, her scrying the brother had proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was indeed the Prince of Landor. Fletch was troubled at what prospect that might bring to himself, Fate, and Yonder. However, one thing was for certain. Change was on the autumn breeze that blew strong across the rolling hills. A few hours had passed by the time Fletch had finished working on the litter, and the sun was now high in the sky. He had lashed the 2 saplings together with the rushes he gathered, and using a blanket, he had made a hammock between the 2 braces. Also, with the small amount of rope he had stored in his pack, he created a makeshift harness. Yonder, who was curious at first and watched intently as the fox twisted the ropes into knotted loops, had stormed off in indignation when he learned what Fletch intended for the ropes. Fletch could still see him in the distance, venting his ire upon any fish unlucky enough to live in the bend of the small creek. Yonder had carried the 3 of them out of the forest the night before and far into the rolling plains. However, the long stretches of grassy hills with their sharp rocks protruding like bleached fangs were vast to the extreme. They could not afford delay, and if the prince could not travel upon his own power, Yonder would have to compromise his pride. Fletch, sufficiently happy with the litter and the harness, now moved to where Fate slept. She was curled tightly beneath her blanket, only her long white ears poked out from underneath. Fletch knelt down next to her, and the sound of heavy breathing suggested she was still deep asleep. Fletch gave a small sigh and reached out and took the end of one of her ears between his fingers. He gave it a gentle tug. Fate didn't move. He gave the ear a more persistent little tug. A paw came out from under the blanket to swat the annoying fly. Fletch chuckled softly as the blanket fell down to reveal Fate's face. Fletch decided to try a new tactic, so he reached out and tickled the sensitive hairs around the base of the rabbit's ears. Fate's eyes jerked open and she lifted her head off the pack quickly. She looked around in bleary fashion and reached out towards Fletch instinctively with an incoherent mumble, and he took her paw reassuringly. Because of how she had been sleeping, the fur on her cheeks stuck out at an odd angle, and it gave her a distinctly frazzled look. "We have to get going," Fletch said. He gave her paw a small shake and then let it go. A groan and the sound of a head slamming back down onto the pack Fate used as a pillow was her only reply. Fletch chuckled again and stood. Fate had never been a morning person, and after the events of the night before, he decided to give her as much room as he could. After a few more disgusted noises, Fate tossed the blanket off herself and stumbled off towards the direction of the creek. Fletch started to break camp properly. He stowed the medicinal things Fate had used on Felix in her pack, and then rolled her discarded blanket into a tight bundle before cinching it tight to her bag. His own things had been stowed for hours already, so there was little left to manage. He took Fate's pack over to the litter and positioned it so that the blanket roll would act as a headrest. Then he placed his own pack on the litter. Edek might grumble, but he would never feel the difference in the weight, strong as he was. Fletch placed 2 fingers into his mouth and gave a sharp whistle. Edek's head jerked up from the creek and looked towards him. Fletch waved with an arm raised high above his head in signal. Edek snapped at the water once or twice more, then turned and leisurely headed towards camp. When Fate returned from the creek, her face and ears were wet, but the hair on her cheek still stood out at a somewhat awkward angle. She moved to Fletch, who stood at the remnants of the fire and warmed his paws. Fate rubbed her own cold, wet paws in the meager heat of the embers, and Fletch offered her a strip of cooked venison. "Is there nothing else?" Fate complained in a downtrodden voice as she half-heartedly took the meat. "Not unless you prefer grass," Fletch said. He kicked dirt on the coals of the fire, which snuffed it out. "This stuff always turns my stomach," Fate grumbled. She took a bite of the meat and forced it down with a grimace. "What I wouldn't give for a good vegetable stew." She looked up as Edek joined them. "Or maybe a fish?" she added in a hopeful plea. Edek crunched noisily on his catch, but stopped as he understood what Fate had asked. He glanced quickly between the pair of them with a wild eye. Fletch laughed at the bewildered look on Edek's face. "Nothing doing, it would seem," he said, then jerked a thumb towards the litter. "He's already mad at me for that. Best not to push our luck, eh?" Edek looked away pointedly. "I am no farrier," he said, annoyed. Fletch made an exasperated gesture with his paw and walked away towards their gear. Fate moved very close to Edek's massive head. She reached up and took hold of one of the spikes protruding from his bony jaw. It was so large her paw could barely close upon it. Edek's head lowered slightly, and he looked Fate square in the face with a huge vertical pupil. "Please," Fate said in a very sweet voice. She waggled the last bit of her cooked meat at him. Edek watched her for a moment in stoic silence. He blinked once. Then his huge mouth opened a crack, and he gingerly accepted the offering. Fate let go of the spike and smiled wildly as Edek moved towards the litter he had resolved to bear. As he passed Fletch, if by accident or on purpose, his large tail sideswiped the fox and sent him sprawling into the dirt. Edek lay down flat on his belly next to the litter and waited. Fate stifled a laugh and went to help Fletch, who had gotten to his feet with an annoyed look and snatched the harness he'd made off the ground. The fox walked over to Edek, who was looking away into the distance in an aloof manner. "So, has he woken up at all?" Fate asked as she took one of the ends of the makeshift harness and walked to the other side of Edek. She passed the rope around the front of his huge chest, through one of the loops, and passed the end back to Fletch. "No, he's been quiet all morning," Fletch answered. He fastened the end of the rope and tossed the rest of the harness over Edek's massive scaled back so it ran down his length. "I tried everything I know on him," Fate said downtrodden. "I really don't know what to do next. None of my techniques seem to do anything." Fate and Fletch went to where the litter rested and lifted it up and leaned it against Edek's haunches. "Vayanoda," Edek said unenthused. His great head was laid upon the ground, and he would not look at them while he was being unceremoniously rigged. It was clear he was still very unhappy about the whole process. Fate looked across at Fletch with eyes wide. "The waters of Yulefrond," she said excitedly. "Oh, Edek, you're brilliant." Fate wrapped both her arms around as much of Edek as she could and hugged him tightly. A low humming sound came from Edek and filled the air. "Those mountains are a long way off," Fletch said. "I hope he can make it that far." The fox finished tying off the litter and glanced at the prince with a doubtful eye. "He can. He will. I know it," Fate said. She moved over to the prince who lay on the ground. as unmoving as when they first put him there. Fletch came up beside her, and together they bent down and lifted the prince. The prince gave a slight groan and an incoherent mumble as they positioned him on the litter and placed his head upon the stacked packs. Edek got to his feet, and the prince pitched upward, but Fletch's woodcraft held with ease, and the litter was steady. "Hang in there, lad," Fletch said. He picked up his sword and buckled it on. Then he led the way down the small hill. Fate and Edek followed with the baggage, princely and otherwise. They filled their water skins from the small creek at the base of the hill. Edek stood long, drinking deep of the clear water. When he eventually raised his head, they headed out. East they traveled, Fletch picking the best path he could through the brush, all the while keeping the Sierra Mountains to their south as they went. The terrible forest from whence they had come eventually faded into the distance. Before long it was out of sight, and then it only existed as a memory. The vast reaches of the rolling landscape underneath their feet was an exercise in uphill and down valley. When they came upon what looked to be the remnants of a long-abandoned farm, Fate was able to gather a few strawberries and blackberries that had thrown down their confinements and now grew wild about the tangles. Nothing more of use was to be found, so they continued. They had started late in the morning, and the sun was already well past midday by a few hours when something unexpected happened. "Hello," said a weak voice. The prince had come to and was watching Fate from the depths of the litter with heavy-lidded eyes. "Hello," Fate replied. She walked up next to the litter and kept pace with the long strides of Edek. The prince jostled slightly as the litter dragged over a hidden stone in the grass. He twisted his head slowly around to look up at Edek pulling the litter. "Is that a giant lizard?" the prince asked in a befuddled voice. Fletch, who walked next to Edek's head, smiled broadly and patted Edek consolingly on his huge, muscled shoulder. "Edek is a drake," Fate explained. "And he understands you, so be polite." Edek's massive head twisted around to hover over the prince. It blocked out the sun overhead, shading the rabbit entirely. After a moment, he let out a great snort, which blasted hot air down on the prince and shook his fur all over. "Right," the prince said as Edek's massive head twisted back forward. "He smells wrong," Edek said in a tone meant only for Fletch. Fletch frowned slightly, but said nothing. They traveled in silence for a moment. The wind and heavy-clawed footfalls of Edek was the only sound. Fate removed the bag she had gathered berries in from around her shoulders and offered it to the prince. "You should eat," she said gently. "Ah!" The prince winced as he reached for the bag. He looked down at his left arm wrapped in linen cloth with surprise. When he went to unwrap the cloth, Fate hurriedly reached out and stopped him. "You've been hurt," Fate said. "You should wait until we stop for camp. Just eat, for now." She placed the bag of berries next to the prince and flipped the flap open. The prince took a fat strawberry from the bag and ate it slowly. Once he had started, it was clear he was ravenously hungry, and it wasn't long before the rabbit had finished off the bag entirely. Fate smiled slightly at the prince's gusto. "Excellent," she said and handed her water skin to the prince. This too he drank in full. "Your appetite seems to be intact. That is a good sign." The prince leaned his head back against the pack and closed his eyes. A cool breeze blew strong across the plains, and the prince shivered. He was bare-chested, except for the bandage that was wrapped around his paw and forearm. All of a sudden the prince opened his eyes and looked around. Fate was still walking steadily next to the litter dragged by Edek, while Fletch walked in front, guiding a proper path. To each of them, the prince cast an increasingly suspicious look. "Where are we?" the prince asked somewhat nervously. "The wild Gingling," Edek said in a low rumble. "Felix. My name is Felix," Prince Felix said. He raised up as best he could. He looked around as if trying to spy others that may be farther abroad. However, they were only 4 and surrounded by never-ending hills of grass. "Yes, we know who you are. Be at ease. We are friends," Fate said soothingly. Apparently, the prince could not see anything to contradict her words and slowly relaxed again. "Well, who are you then?" he asked of the pearly rabbit. "My name is Fate," Fate said. "You've met Edek, and the scruffy-looking fellow at the front is Fletch." She dodged slightly to the side as a clump of grass came flying back from the front of the caravan. Fate leaned in close to the litter. "Don't mind Fletch. He's probably annoyed I gave away his berries." The litter dragged over another particularly rough piece of uneven terrain, and the prince winced as he bumped up and down. They were passing through a section of land where the large framework of old structures loomed upon either side of the path. They were twisted with old growth, and nature had reclaimed them thoroughly. "This place feels familiar to me," Prince Felix said slowly. He gazed at the structures in earnest. "It was a town once," Fletch answered solemnly. "A town." Prince Felix looked closely at a blasted, tangled mound of rubble as he was dragged past on the litter. The structure was large and might have once been an inn or possibly a home to many, but it had been reduced down to its very foundations. The remnants of a door were still visible, although ivy had worked its way up and bound it tightly, while the rest of the structure was overtaken by long weeds and creepers. What could do such damage? Was there a fire? I don't see any charring. "Lightcraft," Fletch said quietly. "Lightcraft," Prince Felix said aghast. "But Lightbearers would not do such things." He looked suddenly at Fate for an explanation. "No, they would not," Fate said darkly. They passed many more structures of the once town, yet none had fared any better than the home at the end of the row. Whoever had overseen this work must have had some sort of vendetta, for the wantoned signs of destruction was clear. Not a single building or structure was left standing. The entire town had been completely razed. Before long, Edek had bore the litter through the sad remains of ruin, out of the town and back into the sloping hillsides of green. "Why aren't we taking the King's roads?" Prince Felix asked as he noticed Fletch was clearly taking a path that chose the vast countryside. "Bah!" Fletch scoffed. "The King's roads? Do you want us to be caught?" "What's wrong with the King's roads?" Prince Felix asked. His voice became very suspicious. "Wait a minute. Who exactly are you? Are you thieves? Brigands? Only ne'er-do-wells are wary of roads well protected?" His voice heated up. "Am I to be ransomed like goods at auction? Answer me." The prince had a sour look on his face, as if he had a sick stomach. Edek gave a ruthless growl, deep and menacing. "Peace," Fate said quickly. "We're bearers to the light of the keepers." "Light bearers? So you claim," Felix spat. "If you were in danger," Fletch posed, "wouldn't we have already taken advantage of you? Or just left you for dead? Why bandage you and cart you all this way? Why not just feed you to Edek?" "You could still," Edek rasped. Prince Felix looked bewildered at the sudden logic. "But you did not answer me," he said stubbornly. "Why would Lightbearers fear the roads? My father holds your conclave in high esteem. If anything, it's the quickest way to resolve yourself of me. Ah. Fletch made a sad noise, as if he suddenly realized the terrible mistake he had made. Edek came to a slow stop, and Fate looked at the prince with overlarge eyes. There was an uncomfortable moment of tension. Your father, Fate said in a careful voice, King Doman, has been dead for nearly 5 years. A few quiet heartbeats of respect passed, and then Edek began to walk again, dragging the litter behind. Dead? But Prince Felix's voice died off as the words sank in. Suddenly he looked as if his stomach was dangerously close to being emptied of all the hard-picked berries. I'm sorry to give you such dreadful news, Fate said earnestly. The prince looked at Fate suspiciously, but she could tell, when the hard lines of his face fell into deepest sorrow, that he believed her, and his pain was real. 5 years they'd had to process the tragedy, but for the prince, it must be a most terrible blow. The young rabbit shaded his eyes and turned away from her. They traveled in silence for a long time. The prince was lost in his own thoughts and mourning and did not speak. Fate let him be, but still walked beside the litter respectfully, unless she spied a place where saplings grew. Then she would move off and gather any long, slender branches suitable for arrows she could find. All of hers were spent, and she felt helpless without the means to protect herself. Afternoon turned into evening, and they began to look for a good spot to camp. Fletch, with his long legs, would run ahead for minutes at a time before returning to the group. He did this several times before eventually stopping to dictate to Edek the place he had found suitable for the night. Once the drake was confident in the fox's instructions, Fletch fished around in his pack for a moment, then once again sprinted off into a sparse valley filled with tall grasses and brush which hid him instantly. Edek had no trouble finding the place Fletch had described. It was a large formation of rock which jutted out from the grassy plains. Atop it a slender tree with splitting forks grew, and a small creek wasn't far off. The large rock had a concave face which would hopefully provide some cover from the wind, which had picked up strong as night gathered closer. When they arrived, Fate helped Prince Felix down off the litter. The prince was somewhat unsteady, but some of his strength had returned. After he was settled, Fate unhooked the litter from Edek and took the rope harness from around his chest. Edek gave a violent shake. His scales rasped slightly as they brushed the stone. Then he left them and went to sit upon the great rock above. Fate busied herself making a fire with wood she got from slender trees nearby, and soon she had a merry flame crackling in the small dell. Prince Felix had been very quiet the entire afternoon. A spiteful wind blew through the valley as if to mirror his dark mood. He shivered at the cold breeze despite the warmth which came from the newly built fire. Fate noticed, and she went to their travel packs. She rummaged through Fletch's gear until she found one of his spare shirts, the sleeve of which was stained rusty brown from blood and had a tear in it. Don't worry, Fate said conspiratorially as she handed the shirt to the prince. He'll get over it. Thanks. The prince gratefully pulled the shirt over himself. Who took over, if my father is gone? Felix's voice seemed to catch, and he swallowed hard. Fate watched sadly as the prince fought hard with a newfound lump in his throat. King Vladimir I, she answered. Your brother rules Landor now. Fate gathered the small pile of sticks she had collected throughout the day, then foraged through their gear until she found a camp knife. She went and sat down next to the fire and began to whittle and straighten the wooden shafts. Vlada is ruling, Prince Felix asked once he had conquered his emotions. A proclamation went out to all the land. It stated that Prince Felix had been lost and presumed dead. Fate said. She measured each shaft carefully and cut them all to the same length. A few months later, another proclamation said that King Doman had passed in his sleep. The funeral lasted a week. Representation was sent from all 4 kingdoms. Your brother's coronation was a week after that. 4 kingdoms? Prince Felix asked. Yes, every kingdom sent individuals to honor your father, Fate explained. Prominent members from Landor, the nobility of Metagaz, the chieftains of the White Mountains, and the pack leader from the Sierra Mountains. They say the king's death is what eventually brought them into the fold and finally sealed the territories together in peace. Wrath. Prince Felix made what sounded like a curse. Sorry, what's Fate began to ask, but they were interrupted. Fletch had made his way back into camp. He dropped a leather sling amongst the gear and held out 2 red-tailed pheasants by the neck as he moved into the light and warmth of the fire. You found some. Wonderful, Fate said as she noticed the 2 birds. Yeah, Fletch replied, somewhat distracted, looking down over his shoulder. His attention was on his bushy tail, where a thorny branch had embedded itself in the thick fur. He made to grab it, but missed. The fox spun in a small circle and reached for it again. This time he nearly knocked into the small fire. Fate, sensing danger, stood quickly, dropped her pile of sticks, and went to Fletch. The fox looked up at her sudden movement, but his sharp gaze flicked to Prince Felix. Hey, is that my shirt? He asked as Fate caught him by the shoulders and forced him to the ground. Gingerly, Fate worked her nifty fingers around the thorn branch and pulled it free from the tangle it made of Fletch's tail. She tossed the thorn into the fire and took the 2 birds from him. Deftly, she plucked the flight feathers from each of the birds, then handed them back to Fletch. The fox began to pluck the rest of the pheasant as Fate returned to her pile of sticks and sat again. From a pouch, she removed a coil of fine, waxy sinew and a few arrowheads. Each of the arrowheads had a unique shape Fate favored, something between an acorn and a leaf. Deadly enough, but not barbed if a shot were to go careless. Careful and meticulously, she wrapped the shafts with the sinew before slowly attaching the flight feathers to her soon-to-be arrow. Fletch soon had the pheasants plucked clean and the breast of the birds removed. He skewered them and set them to roast in the fire. Hey, Yedek, he called, looking up. The head of the drake turned to peer down at them from his stony perch. Fletch tossed the carcass of the birds up, and they landed on the shelf of rock. Promptly, the sound of crunching bones could be heard from above. Before long, the rich smells of roasted bird filled the small outcrop. Fletch carefully removed the meat and portioned it out to each of them. They sat quietly and ate the juicy little birds while listening to the music of the oncoming night. The whistling wind's high melody set to the steady cadence of the fire's crackling. I want to go north, Prince Felix said through a mouthful of pheasant. I thought about what you told me, and I have questions that need to be answered. You're not the ones to give them to me. Only my brother has what I seek. We head for Middlestone, Fletch said directly. He poked the fire with a branch, which sent embers into the air as the ash settled. Then he placed it atop the flames. From there, we can skirt the outer heed to the north, cross the river Runar, and follow it up into the Vernola range. If you're lucky, your paw won't have fallen off by then. The prince looked angry, as if he wanted to argue, but Fate placed her freshly made arrow aside, stood up quickly, and moved to where he sat. The prince looked very wary at her being so close, but she ignored him, reached out slowly, and took his bandaged paw. I've trained at the temple in lightcraft, Fate said slowly, as she began to unwrap the bandage from around the prince's paw. Techniques of water that heal, as well as studying traditional methods of herbalism and alchemy. She unwrapped the last bit of linen cloth and uncovered the prince's paw. But never in my time have I seen anything like this before. The paw still wore the crimson catalyst, and the black tendrils which stretched back towards the wrist were still as nauseating as when she had first glimpsed them. The ashen gray look had not changed, and was in stark contrast to the rest of the prince's cinnamon fur. Fate shook her head in disapproval. "Can you move your hand?" she asked seriously. Prince Felix wiggled his fingers and winced slightly. His forefinger moved independently, but the middle and the last moved as one with the ring, fused together by the dark crystalline substance which dug into the skin. "When we first found you, I tried every technique I know," Fate said. "Nothing seemed to have any effect, so I bound it as best I could." She motioned at the fur closest to the ring. "However, this discoloration of the fur was only around the paw. Now it seems to have moved almost to the wrist." She looked the prince directly in the face. "I think whatever is happening to you is progressing. Perhaps it is more akin to, say, lithium craft and not healing. The ring is a catalyst after all, but I don't know how to help you. I want to take you somewhere that can." Fate wrapped the prince's paw again with the linen cloth, then tied the bandage gently with a knot. Now that Fate had stopped speaking, they noticed a low humming noise permeating their surroundings, and it was becoming louder and louder still. Fletch cocked his head to the side and then looked up at the shelf of rock above. Slowly, the fox got to his feet and motioned for the other two to follow. Together, they climbed the embankment around the edge of the dell onto the rocky shelf above. A gigantic autumn fire moon was blazing orange as it hung low on the horizon. Edek was sitting still as a stone and watching the moon as it encroached upon the dark sky. The low humming noise was coming from him. They all stood very still, watching. Even the air seemed to falter as if it was witnessing something rare and sacred. The drake had an odd look, and the fire from the autumn moon blazed in his eyes. Then, in a low chanting verse that reverberated with his humming, Edek began. "Under stars and flaming moon, the greatest of our kindred flew. The horde was bright, it spurred their flight, yet sorrow ever was their plight. Burning bright they took to flight, across the sea, ne'er more for sight." The deep humming continued long after Edek fell silent. "The lay of the Drakions," Fate whispered to the night. Edek turned his great head towards them silently. "It speaks of the great Drakions, their exodus at the founding of the Crimson Pact. Some texts say the Drakions were unwieldy and prone to greed. Much hatred was shared between the old kingdoms and the Drakions. All shared the same doom," Edek said slowly. "The leaders of the old kingdoms, they formed the Crimson Pact. The Crimson Catalyst was a show of good faith and a stop to the hostilities, but the great Drakions were never seen again," Fate finished softly. Edek's great eyes fell upon Prince Felix. "Your clutch mate. He digs deep in this outer heed, for he covets what you already have," he said. His coppery eyes flashed bright in the glow of the fire moon. "The first with a flame holds devastating power, for a fire mislaid levels all beast. A great jewel he seeks, but to his folly What you have is no simple hoard trinket. It was ever at the heart of the Drakions. Edek's piercing gaze bore into Prince Felix. His great eyes never blinked, and he took a deep breath. Is your worth done justice by it?
Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.